Now.
On 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app.
O'Connor and Company.
7:06 now on O'Connor and Company, and here on the East Coast, sunrise is about 7 minutes away. That means we'll start to really get a good look at the damage wrought by Hurricane Milton across Florida, starting with, well, where it hit specifically first between Sarasota and Tampa there, as we're already seeing incredible images of the roof of Tropicana Field ripped to shreds and standing water incredibly high in certain areas of the city. But again, as the sun rises, we'll really get a look at how bad things are. Coming up, our continued deep and detailed analysis, not just of the damage, but also of the government response, starting in 30 minutes with Florida Lieutenant Governor Jeanette Nunez. 8:05, we'll check in on the international scene with KT McFarland. And then at 8:35, Tom Bevan of Real Car Politics on electoral politics. It's Larry O'Connor with Patrice Onwuka. Good morning, Patrice.
Good morning, Larry.
And joining us right now is Brian Cavanaugh. Now, he's a former official with DHS and FEMA. He's currently a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Cavanaugh, thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Larry. Good morning, Patrice. Appreciate being on the show this morning.
There's obviously been a lot of discussion about the federal government's role here and their response. Let's start with Helene, if we can. From your perspective, based on the fact that you had to deal with many of these natural disasters and weather-related disasters during your time in those agencies, is there something amiss here with regard to the response to Helene and what appeared to be some delays? And in fact, we're still seeing some citizens in some of the worst areas saying that they still haven't seen any actual representation or any kind of relief from federal agencies. Is that common?
So I think it's really important to set like a good understanding the federal government on response to these events. And Hurricane Helene, yes, it was a hurricane, and we were able to pre-position federal government assets along the coastline in Florida. So I think Florida saw like an immediate federal response. But when you have inland flooding or these unforeseen events downrange that are kind of 0-day notice, the federal government's response is typically 48 to 72 hours. So I think first, it's going to take about 3 days to see a robust response, especially since they were pulling assets from the coast areas, inland and north. But what was surprising to me was the lack of visible leadership and the lack of haste, or if visible leadership would have at least instilled the optics that you were trying to reposition and move in quickly. We didn't see that for over a week.
You're talking about more like a visible sense of urgency and attentiveness to the situation.
Absolutely. And I think the optics of visible leadership go a long way in making the public feel like the government's got the response well in hand.
Well,
and instead of seeing that, they saw a lot of absconding from top-level leadership that first weekend, first couple of days into the week after from Helene.
And top-level leadership is specifically Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas, who in the midst of this catastrophe, as we saw people still stranded and we were still sort of getting a sense of who needed help and how vast the damage and human toll was, he issued a statement saying that he didn't think that FEMA had the funding to make it through hurricane season, and this at a time where we know it's been well documented that close to $1 billion was used to relocate and shelter illegal immigrants. Now, I'm told if I point out those basic facts that I just laid out that I'm engaged in dangerous misinformation. Can you help me figure that out exactly? What's true and what isn't?
So I don't think anything you've highlighted is misinformation. I think there's a lot of nuance here. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's budget is pretty expansive and covers a lot of different buckets or colors of funding. So the Disaster Relief Fund had a little over $2 billion on hand when the storm hit. That's sufficient funding to get you through the response phase. Not enough funding to get you through long-term recovery, but long-term recovery is not something you're paying for today. The challenge here has been the redirect of mission priorities. So the funding that they're using from the Emergency Food Shelter Program to redirect towards the southern border and really funding the move of migrants into the country. That wasn't coming from the Disaster Relief Fund, but it showed an entire change in optics and tempo for the agency away from helping disaster survivors and towards the southwest border self-inflicted crisis. And then they plussed up the emergency food and shelter program. That used to be a $100 million program when I was at DHS.
Yeah.
It is now a $1.4 billion program
Massive.
with $800 million getting transferred from CBP to FEMA.
Wow.
So that's just another reason why people need to understand the legislative fixes they're proposing allow these transfers of funds to continue away from CBP into FEMA to address instead of addressing the cause, kind of facilitating the movement.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think that's what's frustrating for many Americans when speaking big picture about the federal budget and the priorities, where it just feels like, Kamala Harris showing up with a $750 check seems like a spit in the face to hardworking Americans when they see, the resources being used to shelter and relocate and resettle, frankly, right, illegal immigrants. But from a process standpoint, what happens next from a congressional standpoint? Does Congress need to do a separate supplemental bill? And just going forward, how do you ensure that there is always enough money in these funds for disaster relief, as it should be?
So I want to unpack a few things there. The $750 checks for immediate needs, that's not something they're giving out to survivors just because you survived the storm and you impacted area. They're actually making you go through this application process with the Small Business Administration. And in fact, a lot of people are going to get denied that $750 if they have insurance and if they have other things where the federal government can point to and say, you have other resources, you don't need our resources. So I think a lot of Americans are going to have the sting of that as they apply for these programs and get rejected. But on the side of making sure the disaster relief fund has the resources it needs to respond and be agile to these events, I think Congress has done a really good job over the last decade, really incorporating a variety of mechanisms to make sure there's funding available. Obviously, we're in an era where we get a lot of continuing resolutions, and that's probably not the most helpful or sustainable for the disaster relief fund. But again, I think they've built in mechanisms. They have ways of forecasting and establishing this emergency. The disaster relief fund has two accounts in it, majors and base. Majors are paying for disasters that happened several years ago and have major critical infrastructure projects that have a long tail to them.
Okay.
The base is something that's using annual emergency response needs, and they have ways of forecasting and developing models to figure out how much money they need in that base. I saw where they had $2.2 billion on hand. A lot of it was in the majors, but there's room to work with Congress to have access to that for the base. And they can also do this thing called immediate needs funding. So there's a lot of tools FEMA has at its hands to make that work.
So it almost sounds like when the White House press secretary says, if we want to fix this money problem, Congress needs to come back right now to do their job. That doesn't sound accurate.
That's actually misinformation.
That's misinformation. Yeah, thank you. Brian Cavanaugh, visiting fellow at Heritage and a former DHS and FEMA official. I just want to put a bow on this. From your perspective, knowing the accusations that are flying right now, can you isolate anything other than Marjorie Taylor Greene suggesting that somebody can control the weather, which I don't want to dabble in right now? Beyond that, is there anything out there other than actual criticism that could be a matter of opinion about how you criticize the federal response here? But is there anything that should be termed lies or misinformation, dangerous misinformation, as we keep hearing?
I haven't been boots on the ground in the impacted areas, and I'm getting just everything, secondhand, thirdhand. And I've got to tell you, it's hard to kind of parse reality from what's hyperbole out there.
Yeah.
But I think if you were looking at things you could do to kind of make FEMA more sustainable, more robust for the future, I think there's got to be a way to look at and see, what can we do to share with the private insurance market and private sector some of the long-term recovery efforts.
Gotcha.
And how can we maximize the federal government's ability to respond to that overwhelming catastrophic event the first 92, 108 hours.
Brian Cavanaugh, we got to leave it there. Thank you for lending your
information.
expertise to this. I really do appreciate it. And it would be helpful if those who are claiming that there is misinformation out there if they would be specific and say, here, they're saying this and it's misinformation. As of now, the only thing that we've heard is that you're not allowed to say the truth, which is FEMA has spent upwards to $1 billion relocating and sheltering migrants. And the Secretary of Homeland Security says that FEMA does not have money right now in their hurricane relief fund. That, they're saying, is misinformation.
For the last few weeks, there's been a reckless, irresponsible, and relentless promotion of disinformation and outright lies.